Thank you, Ibrahim. I'm Tim McManus. I'm a member of the board of directors for the Americas for Turner and Townsend. I'm also the industry director for the Global Leaders in Construction Management program at Columbia. And I'm also the chair of the board of advisors for the Smart City Works Venture Studio. I'm honored to be joined here today by two leaders in the industry who I also consider to be good friends. Kevin Corbett is the CEO of New Jersey Transit, responsible for the nation's largest statewide public transportation system with more than 11,000 employees and taking 944,000 weekday trips when operating at normal capacity. John Dionisio has been a partner and the director of business development for Meridiam North America for the last 15 years. And Meridiam is one of the largest private investors in public infrastructure in the world. I especially want to thank these two Georgetown alums for joining us today, despite the fact that they got knocked out of the NCAA tournament last week and ruined my bracket. But I'll put that beside. But thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. We've all seen the latest ASC infrastructure report card for the United States. And while we're very happy that the America got a passing grade of C+, barely passing, better than a D- 4 years ago, it's indicative that our infrastructure is still broken. In the state of New York, for example, 10% of the bridges in the state are structurally deficient. Road repairs throughout the state cost drivers an average of $625 each. The need for drinking water improvement and expansion requires a total of $23 billion. So it's indicative that New York State, one of the most advanced states in our union, still has a long way to go with our infrastructure. In addition to the grade, we've also seen that the gap between what is projected to be funded by government and what is needed to bring America's infrastructure up to a state of good repair has risen significantly over the last 4 years by $500 billion to a total of $2.6 trillion. If this continued underinvestment in our infrastructure continues for the next 15 to 20 years, it's going to cost our country significantly. It'll mean a total of about $10 trillion of economic loss. It could mean a loss of 3 million jobs. And it could also mean a loss of about $2.4 trillion of lost exports. Now, for folks like John at Meridiam and Gerard Bouchel at Carlisle Airports Group, this provides a great opportunity for private investment to advance and further develop our nation's highways, rail systems, bridges, and in Gerard's case, JFK Airport and Terminal 1. My last check, though, indicates that about 70% of our states across the country allow public-private partnerships by legislation. But in reality, only 8 to 10 states really drive PPPs. In order to attract private investment, it's essential to make such projects investable and attractive to the Meridians of the world, the Carlisles of the world, and supportive of the capital plans of agencies like New Jersey Transit and the Port Authority of New York. And that's what we want to explore here today. So Kevin, let me start with you if I could. This past year, you developed a capital plan for New Jersey Transit for the first time. And given all of the revenue challenges that you've seen and you're currently seeing, do you foresee a greater use of private investment in public infrastructure to support NJT's overall capital program?
Yeah, Tim, thanks. A pleasure being here, and thanks for everyone join us today. Certainly John, I think Catherine Garcia, so a whole bunch of friends out there. But absolutely, we have a $17 billion capital plan, the first one, and we were known to be an agency in tremendous trouble when I came in 3 years ago with Governor Murphy. And in order to right the ship, we didn't even have a basic baseline assessment. It was good people, but they were just trying to constantly put Band-Aids and duct tape to try to keep the system going. So without having a 5-year capital plan and a strategic plan where you're going to be taking the agency, you have to you need the funding. And so we put that together, and we have about 12 billion of that 17 billion identified. So we have a $5 billion gap, and this is very similar to a lot of transit agencies around the country and around the globe. So we're certainly very positive on the comments that we're hearing out of the Biden administration. Certainly, Secretary Buttigieg yesterday Give a big plug for a project very near and dear to our hearts. The Hudson Tunnel project, the Gateway project, together with our colleagues Amtrak and friends over in New York. But there's a lot more of that where you look at being able to fill that gap. States always have their ups and downs with their budget cycles, and they're competing with healthcare, education, et cetera. And the main focus for most transit agency is the state of good repair, making sure you maintain your system. So as we look at the need for expansion, certainly in congested areas like New Jersey, the most congested, highly populated state in the country per square mile, population density, we're not going to be building many highways to get out of that. So as we have growth, it really has to be through our transit systems. And when we look at what we need to do just to maintain, a lot of these things are legacy from the 19th century railroads that went bankrupt. So we look at some of the expansion projects we'd like to do, and clearly, there's not going to be enough money coming from, for our case, Trenton, and even likely from Washington. So we need to look to fill that gap with public-private partnerships. And I would say in New Jersey and New York, they're having some very successful ones. The general tone is that, in the US, as you said, only 8 states, but even some of the places where you have had progress, then it seems to die off. And I think there really is a critical need for that going forward in the coming years.
That's great, Kevin. Thank you. So, John, speaking of PPPs, there's been a lot of discussion around the challenges regarding the challenges that concessionaires like Meridiam face for the procurement of PPPs in terms of equitable risk transfer, the time and the expense of the procurement process. Based on the work that you've seen and the things that you've done, what are 2 or 3 of the recommendations that you would make that could improve the procurement process for a public-private partnership?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. And first off, thank you for inviting me. I must say that sharing the stage with Kevin, who I've known gratefully for a very long time, is humbling. The fact that the Hoyas could represent is also impressive. And as a SEPA alum, I must also give a shout out to Columbia. So I'm happy to be here. It's a great question. P3 has been a very effective tool to unlock some of the most critically important infrastructure projects globally, but certainly here in the US. Not far from where I'm sitting now, LaGuardia Airport Central Terminal, the first airport of this scale really to be built in the US since the 80s, adopted the P3 model. And other projects, as many I'm sure in the audience have studied or know, the Port of Miami Tunnel, the Long Beach Courthouse, have all been successful examples of how P3s could be procured well. Before I get to recommendations, I thought it'd be important to note that what I think makes investments attractive for private investors is also the assurance that the proper technical parties are willing and able to take the risks needed to really do 2 things. Number 1, give the client comfort that they are getting value for money. And number 2, give the investor comfort that they're mitigating risk. Without some changes to the way projects are procured, without learning from lessons, I fear that contractors and operators may continue to lose interest, which in turn will affect the private sector's interest in these projects. So figuring out how to learn from where it's worked well and taking stock of where it hasn't worked well, I think is important. And after being in this business for 16 years now, the 3 recommendations that I thought I'd share are as follows. First, best value determination should always include technical points. This is a world where engineering and program management innovation should win projects, not financial engineering. It shouldn't be surprising that the most heralded P3 projects, the ones that finish on time and under budget, aren't necessarily the ones that are awarded to the lowest bidder. Secondly, risk transfer doesn't mean leaving the private sector alone without any support. Infrastructure is complicated, and even the best run procurements still need to account for unknowns that arise during construction and operations. Clients need to be committed to help solve problems, even if the financial risk does not fit squarely with them. And at the same time, the private sector needs to engage clients and partner effectively. And the last recommendation I note is that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. I've said this on other panels, but clients in the US should be more Canadian and start with where the last projects have succeeded. There have been great advancements in risk transfer, and actually there are now great contractual documents in the market that coalesce on proper risk transfer. TxDOT is one place where, with the help of industry experts, they rewrote the design build guideline to address some of the imbalanced risk transfer. So I hope that that model can find itself with other clients, so we're not reinventing the wheel each time.
That's great, John. I think to your point, we've also seen over the last couple of years, a couple of major contractors who've said we're not going to play in the PPP space anymore just because of the inequitable risk transfer. So we've seen that fall out exactly. And you mentioned being Canadian. Infrastructure Ontario clearly has progressed many P3s very successfully across social infrastructure as well as regular infrastructure. So great points. Kevin, I want to come back to you in a second about what are your expectations about the stimulus bill for infrastructure, but let me ask the two of you, when you look at the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, they have a national infrastructure plan. They've had a national infrastructure plan for years. It joins together, it pulls together priorities, it helps the economy grow in a certain direction in a very joined up way. Do either of you foresee anything like that coming about with this administration or beyond?
Yeah, I guess, John, I'll take a first stab. I certainly do, Tim. I think it's tricky because, in the U.S. with the federal system, people are often, suspicious of, we're from Washington and we're here to help. But if you look back, to the Eisenhower era, when you look at when UMPTA was set up, having a national policy, whether the funding be competitively, for grants that you have to compete for. But if you have a plan, that's just like any business plan, you need to have something there, maybe variations. But if you have a plan, then you know what it sort of sets the table for what you can do or can't do, and what's going to be incentivized or discouraged. So I think the current administration certainly is talking that way, and I think if packaged the right way, just as Eisenhower did with the highway system, I think a national infrastructure plan is certainly sellable, particularly if it's backed by money.
Yeah, that always helps, right? John, what's your take?
Yeah, I think that I agree wholeheartedly. Well, one of the things that has been part of the debate, and I know the secretary mentioned this recently, is the notion of a national infrastructure bank. Well, I agree with everything Kevin said with respect to a plan. And I think the analogy of a strategic plan in a business is really a powerful one. I think a national infrastructure bank is more necessary from a funding perspective and as a way to unlock projects. I think there are currently tools in existence at the federal government level through TIFIA, through PABS, through RIF. On the renewable energy side, there are credit programs that have been super tools to unlock projects. And my advice to the federal government would be, if there is a national infrastructure plan and a bank, it should focus on providing catalytic capital to get projects started, to allow transit authorities and transportation parties to have funding to go through design and environmental processes that enable projects. Because with respect to funding projects or financing projects, there are some great tools that exist that should be reinforced.
That's good. So let's stay on that same theme. So Kevin, you mentioned your discussions with Secretary Buttigieg, and John, I know you've been advocating for certain elements of an infrastructure stimulus plan in DC. What do each of you expect to come out of the expected infrastructure bill? Not to spill any beans or inside knowledge, but what are your expectations and senses? I know a lot of people are trying to move in different directions. We read different things, but what do the two of you think?
Well, I guess I wish I had some insight, because I'd like to be in there. But I think certainly this administration is putting a major marker down, and you see that from Secretary Buttigieg and from the White House about infrastructure and wanting to get things done. They see this as a window of opportunity, really, even the next 2 years, much less the next 4. And they're talking, obviously, very significant sums of money. What it actually ends up coming out at the end, I think there's, sort of falls in three buckets. One which makes me a little nervous, just personally, is the earmark process coming back. Depending how that used, that can divert funding from things that are either national projects, like we have the Northeast Corridor. I co-chair the Northeast Corridor Commission with Amit Bose, the head of the FRA, and so we need, the whole corridor needs massive investments and support from the government. And then for us in New Jersey, independent of our involvement with the Northeast Corridor, which is a critical part of our transit system, we have huge needs of bus electrification, fleet, bring down the average age of our fleets, et cetera. So there's as well as all sorts of we have the Hudson Bergen Light Rail, which was a D-bomb that was done 30 something years ago. That was very successful public-private partnership, but we need to expand that up to above the George Washington Bridge, for those who know the area. So and again, that some of those will be funding. So I think the funding is critical, but also the process. John mentioned it just in passing, but the importance of permitting for investors. You want to know if you're going to be going into a project that is going to actually move ahead. If you look at the business development dollars that you have to sink into, big projects. And if it's a NEPA process and local permitting and state historic preservation, permits, you look at some projects, and particularly if the community is not receptive, as a private investor, it scares a lot of them away because they look at the challenges. So I think getting the soft side, not just the money side, but making that process, so reducing the risk. There's certain things the public sector can help reduce the risk and take more risk on itself. Certain things the private sector is good at. That public sector may feel risky, but the private sector is used to doing all the time. So that risk sharing, but part of that is really getting permitting and other local issues resolved. Because otherwise, people just say, the money goes where it's treated best. And I think in that, I would also add that it's really important to work. I love transportation. It's my career, but it's not just transportation for transportation's sake. You need to get, broader buy-in, from society, from labor, from environmental groups, et cetera, so that it makes it easier for the decision makers doing that permitting to see, hey, this really does have support. I'm not going to get fired if I permit this thing because, I made all sorts of enemies. So I think there's a lot of soft issues aside from the federal planning, federal dollars. Also, every project is local, has its own personality. So I think those are important issues too.
Great. John, any insights or?
Yeah, no, again, not a tremendous amount to add. I'm hoping that, as I mentioned previously, some of the programs that have been very effective are continued to be reinforced. There's probably $30 to $40 billion of infrastructure assets in the U.S. that would not be possible without private activity bonds and TIFIA. Private activity bonds, the cap has been reached and it requires reauthorization. So I'm hoping that the new administration will continue to focus on these tools that, again, have been effective enablers in really most of, if not all of, the transportation P3s in the last decade. And then I'm also hopeful for some clarity, some dollars around how resilient infrastructure, and that this doesn't mean new energy projects, but resilient projects within transportation, rail electrification that I know Kevin's focused on, electrification from a vehicle perspective, figuring out how funding could unlock those opportunities nationwide is also something that I'm hopeful will be clarified with this administration.
Yeah, to the point that both of you brought up about equitable risk or risk share, and I know there's also been discussion about establishing a risk bank, if you will, where you would be able to bank risk money where, as opposed to one part or the other taking the risk contractually, that it would be pre-funded in accordance with that, so that as it came up, where both parties would be allowed to proceed. So some interesting ideas, so we'll keep touch and hopefully we'll start hearing some things very soon, but it should be welcome for everybody when it does come out. John, let me ask you, you talked before about some of the factors that you look for when considering a PPP opportunity. Could you just touch on one or two, maybe three elements or factors that make a P3 attractive to you in Meridiam?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the first one is somewhat subjective. I call it essentiality. Why does the project make sense now? and why does the project make sense for decades to come? Transit projects in the state of New Jersey or the state of New York are essential. It helps people move from point A to point B effectively to avoid congestion. Courthouses, schools, et cetera. So for us at Meridiam, it's a very somewhat easy first gate. Is this project essential? Will it be impactful for the community? The second is, and this is something that's growing with more focus, is ESG considerations. For us here at Meridiam, it's imperative. How does the infrastructure idea take into consideration environmental, social, and good governance practices? And included in this is getting the community involved as soon as possible. And the third is strong government. You mentioned government needing to be champions of projects, having the right leaders, people like Kevin, people like Pat Foy, but a strong government with a clear path to understanding how the private sector is going to be repaid, where the dollars are coming from to repay the private debt equity, the private debt and private equity is important. P3, as you've heard many times, P3 is a tremendous finance and risk transfer tool. It is not something that bridges funding gaps. So I think strong government clients understand that, and that therefore it's important that as a consideration to make sure that your counterpart is has the financial wherewithal to get a project completed.
Those are great perspectives. Those are great insights and perspectives from both of you. And hopefully your comments will inspire other ideas and solutions to this funding challenge that our country has and our country's infrastructure has in a very significant way. So Kevin, thank you. John, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and your insights as always. I'll now turn it over to Murray Roden, the Global Director of Infrastructure for Turner & Townsend.